She called her husband 17 times while their son was dying. He silenced every single one. While 5-year-old Owen took his last breath in a hospital bed, Derek Mercer was in a luxury hotel suite with his mistress. He heard his phone buzz. He saw his wife's name flash across the screen, and he chose to ignore it. But Derek made one fatal mistake. He forgot who his father-in-law was, a retired federal prosecutor with 30 years of putting criminals behind bars. A man who doesn't forgive, a man who doesn't forget. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay until the end. You won't believe how this story unfolds. If you love justice, hit subscribe and let's begin. The machine stopped beeping at 11:47 on a frozen December night. Caroline Mercer stood motionless in the pediatric intensive care unit, her hands still wrapped around her son's tiny fingers. The warmth was already leaving his skin, fading like the last light of a winter sunset. 5 years of laughter, of bedtime stories whispered in the dark, of sticky kisses and crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, all of it ending in a sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and heartbreak. Owen, her beautiful boy with his father's dark hair and her grandmother's blue eyes, gone. The heart monitor displayed a flat green line, its monotonous tone cutting through the chaos of the medical team's final efforts. A nurse touched her shoulder gently, her voice soft with practiced compassion. "Caroline, we need to prepare him now." But Caroline could not move. She could not breathe. She could only stare at the small face that would never smile at her again, the chest that would never rise with another breath. His favorite stuffed elephant lay tucked beside him on the pillow, the one he called Peanut, the one he could not sleep without. She had promised him everything would be okay. She had held his hand and told him Daddy was coming. She had lied. Where was Derek? The question burned through her shock like acid. She had called him 17 times. 17 times his phone had rung before going to voicemail. 17 times she had begged him to come, to hurry, to please go and answer. Owen's asthma attack had escalated into cardiac distress so quickly, his small heart overwhelmed by the strain of fighting for air. The doctors had tried everything: medications, oxygen, chest compressions that made his tiny body jerk like a broken doll. But a 5-year-old heart can only fight so hard, and Derek had not been there. Caroline finally released Owen's hand, her fingers leaving his with a reluctance that felt like tearing her own skin. She stepped back, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her weight, and pulled her phone from her pocket with trembling fingers. The screen showed 17 outgoing calls to Derek. Not one returned. She scrolled past his name and found the only other number that mattered. Her father. The man who had always been there, even when she pushed him away. The man she had distanced herself from when Derek complained about his interference. His overprotectiveness. His constant presence. Miles Holbrook answered on the first ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" 3 words. That was all she could manage. 3 words that shattered the world into before and after. "Owen is gone. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. She could hear him processing, could imagine his face shifting from confusion to horror to that iron determination she remembered from childhood. Then his voice came through, steady as granite, unshakable as the foundation of a fortress. "I'm on my way. Don't move. I'm coming." The line went dead. Caroline sank into the plastic chair beside Owen's bed, her body finally surrendering to the weight of grief. She did not cry. Not yet. She was beyond tears, suspended in a void so vast it swallowed everything else. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. Somewhere down the hall, another child cried for their mother, and the sound pierced Caroline's heart with a jealousy so fierce it frightened her. That child was alive. That mother could still hold her baby. She looked at Owen's face, peaceful now, the struggle finally over. His long eyelashes rested against pale cheeks. His lips, slightly parted, still held the ghost of his last breath. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Mommy's so sorry." But where was Derek? She knew the answer, even if she could not yet admit it to herself. The knowledge had been building for months, accumulating like snow on a roof until the weight became impossible to ignore. She had seen the credit card statements she was not supposed to find, charges at restaurants she had never visited, hotels she had never stayed in. She had smelled the unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, floral and expensive. Nothing like the simple lavender she wore. She had noticed how he always worked late on Thursdays, how his phone was always face down on the table, how he looked through her instead of at her. But she had made excuses. He was stressed. The job was demanding. Marriage required patience. Tonight of all nights, while their son fought for his life, while she begged and pleaded and prayed for him to answer, he had chosen to be somewhere else, with someone else. At 2:17 in the morning, Derek Mercer finally walked through the hospital doors. Caroline saw him before he saw her. He strode down the corridor with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything, his cashmere coat dusted with snowflakes, his leather shoes clicking against the linoleum. But something was off. His shirt was slightly wrinkled beneath the coat. His hair was disheveled in a way that had nothing to do with rushing. And when he saw Caroline sitting alone in the hallway outside the pediatric unit, his face arranged itself into an expression of concern that came half a second too late. Caroline. His voice was carefully modulated, the tone of a man who had practiced sincerity until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. What happened? My phone died and I just got your messages. I came as fast as I could. She looked up at him. This man she had married 6 years ago in a garden full of white roses. This man she had built a life with, a home with, a child with. This man who had not been there when their son took his last breath. Owen is dead, she said flatly. Derek's face cycled through emotions that did not quite match the moment. Shock, but delayed. Grief, but shallow. Horror, but performed. All of them slightly off. Like an actor who had not rehearsed his lines, who was improvising a scene he had not prepared for. What? No, that's not. He sat down heavily beside her, the chair creaking under his weight. When how 3 hours ago, his heart gave out. The asthma attack triggered cardiac arrest. They tried to save him for 45 minutes. Derek reached for her hand. She let him take it, but she felt nothing. No comfort, no connection, no warmth. Just the cold certainty that everything she thought she knew about her marriage was a lie. His fingers were cold from the winter night, but there was something else. A faint trace of perfume that was not hers. A softness to his skin that suggested recent washing, as if he had tried to scrub away evidence. I'm so sorry, he said. I should have been here. I should have. Yes, you should have. Behind them, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Measured, deliberate, familiar. Caroline turned to see her father approaching. Miles Holbrook was 67 years old. His hair silver now, his face lined with age and the grief of losing his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. He had retired from a distinguished career as a federal prosecutor. 30 years of putting criminals behind bars. 30 years of fighting for justice in courtrooms across the country. His movements were slower now, his body showing the wear of time, but his eyes were sharp as ever. And when they landed on Derek, something dangerous flickered in their depths. Miles did not speak. He simply looked at Derek's rumpled collar, the faint smudge of lipstick on his cuff that Derek had not noticed, the guilt that hung around him like cheap cologne. Then he gathered his daughter into his arms and held her while she finally began to cry. Derek watched them, his expression carefully blank. He had never liked his father-in-law. Too intrusive, he always said. Too controlling. He doesn't trust me. Perhaps Miles had been right not to trust him, but Derek had no idea that the nightmare had already begun. No idea that the man holding his broken wife was already calculating, already planning, already preparing to dismantle everything Derek had built. The war started that night, in the fluorescent hell of a hospital corridor, over the body of a 5-year-old boy who deserved so much more than the father he was given. The funeral was held on a gray Tuesday morning, the sky heavy with clouds that could not decide whether to snow or weep. St. Michael's Church filled with mourners, colleagues from Caroline's hospital, neighbors from Beacon Hill, Derek's business associates in their expensive black suits. The small white casket sat at the front of the sanctuary, covered in white roses, impossibly tiny against the vast emptiness of death. Caroline stood between her father and her husband, dressed in black, her face a mask of controlled grief. She had not slept in 4 days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Owen's face. Every time silence fell, she heard the flatline. Derek played the role of devastated father with practiced ease. He shook hands with mourners, accepting their condolences with appropriately moist eyes. He delivered a eulogy that brought tears to strangers' eyes. his voice cracking at precisely the right moments, his grief perfectly calibrated for public consumption. He spoke of Owen's laughter, of his love for dinosaurs and peanut butter sandwiches, of the way he said, "I love you, Daddy," every night before bed. Caroline listened and wondered if any of it was real. Wondered if Derek had ever truly seen their son, or if Owen had always been just another prop in the performance of her perfect life. At the cemetery, snow began to fall softly on the small casket as it was lowered into the frozen ground. Caroline threw a single white rose into the grave, her hand trembling. "Goodbye, my sweet boy," she whispered. "Mommy loves you forever." Derek stood beside her, his arm around her waist like a prop rather than a partner. When the service ended, he checked his watch. Back at the Beacon Hill townhouse, the performance continued. Friends and family gathered to offer comfort, filling the elegant rooms with quiet conversation and catered food. Carolyn moved through them like a ghost, accepting embraces she could not feel, responding to words she could not hear. Finally, as the last guests departed, the caterers cleaned and left. Silence fell over the house like a shroud. Derek loosened his tie and reached for his coat. "I need to go into the office," he announced, already moving toward the door. "There's a deal closing and I can't miss it." Caroline stared at him. "We just buried our son, and I'm handling it the only way I know how. Working." He shrugged on his cashmere coat, adjusting the collar in the hallway mirror. "I'll be back late. Don't wait up." He was out the door before she could respond, leaving her standing alone in the entryway of the house they had shared, the house where Owen had taken his first steps, spoken his first words, lived his entire brief and beautiful life. Miles had watched the exchange from the living room doorway. Now he approached his daughter, his face carefully neutral, but his eye burning with cold fury. How long has he been like this? Carolyn sank onto the antique settee her mother-in-law had chosen, too exhausted to stand. "Years. I just didn't want to see it." Miles sat beside her, the old leather creaking beneath him. "When your mother was sick, I made a lot of excuses for people who didn't deserve them. I told myself it wasn't the right time to confront certain truths, that we had to focus on her treatment, on keeping hope alive." He paused, his voice roughening with old grief. "I don't want you to make the same mistake I did." "What are you saying?" Dad Miles reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a manila envelope, thick with documents and photographs. "I'm saying that while you were at the hospital with Owen, holding his hand, fighting for his life, I made some calls, old contacts, people who owe me favors from cases I worked decades ago, people who know how to find things that others want hidden." Caroline took the envelope with trembling hands. The paper felt heavy, weighted with secrets. She opened it slowly, almost afraid of what she would find. Inside were photographs. Security camera stills from a hotel lobby. The image is grainy but unmistakable. Derek walking arm in arm with a young blonde woman, their bodies pressed close together, their faces tilted toward each other with intimate familiarity. More photos showed them entering an elevator, Derek's hand resting on the small of the woman's back. Timestamps in the corner of each image showed they arrived at 7:15 in the evening, the night Owen died. "Her name is Vivian Ashford," Miles said quietly, watching his daughter's face. "She's a junior analyst at Derek's firm, 29 years old, unmarried. According to my sources, they've been involved for at least 8 months." Caroline stared at the photos, her husband's hand on another woman's waist, their heads bent together in intimate conversation. His smile, genuine and warm in a way it never was at home anymore. The way he looked at this Vivian was the way he used to look at Caroline. Years ago, before Owen was born, before the marriage became a contract rather than a partnership. "He knew," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He knew I was calling. He knew something was wrong with Owen." Miles nodded grimly. "His phone records show 17 incoming calls from you between 8 and 11 that night. He silenced every single one. The hotel records show he did not leave the room until 2 in the morning. After I imagine he finally checked his messages." The envelope slipped from Caroline's fingers, photographs scattering across the hardwood floor like fallen leaves. She covered her face with her hands, her body shaking with sobs that had no sound. Her father gathered the photos carefully, methodically, placing them back in the envelope with the precision of a man who had handled evidence for 30 years. "What do I do?" Caroline finally asked, her voice muffled by her palms. "What can I possibly do first?" You grieve? Miles placed his hand over hers, warm and solid. You let yourself feel this, all of it. The loss, the betrayal, the rage. You don't push it down or pretend it doesn't exist. He paused, his jaw tightening. Then, when you're ready, we make him pay for every moment he wasn't there, for every call he ignored, for every lie he told. Caroline looked at her father through tear-blurred eyes. Something was shifting inside her, something hard and cold forming in the place where her heart used to be. I want him to lose everything, she said quietly. Everything he values, everything he's built. I want him to know what it feels like to have nothing left. Miles nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction settling over his weathered features. Then we do this right. No emotion in the execution, pure strategy, cold calculation. He owes you a debt he can never repay, but we can make sure he spends the rest of his life trying. For the first time since Owen's death, Carolyn felt something other than grief. She felt rage, and rage, she was discovering, could be a kind of fuel. 3 days after the funeral, Carolyn stood in her bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her was almost unrecognizable. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her cheekbones seemed sharper, her face thinner, as if grief had begun consuming her from the inside. She had not eaten a full meal since Owen died. She had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. But beneath the exhaustion, something else was visible. A hardness in her gaze that had not been there before. A steel forming in the softness. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple black dress that spoke of mourning, but also of purpose. She applied minimal makeup, enough to conceal the worst of the damage. She brushed her hair until it gleamed. Then she walked to Derek's home office. He was there, as she knew he would be, sitting behind his mahogany desk with a crystal glass of whiskey at his elbow. His laptop was open, spreadsheets glowing on the screen. He did not look up when she entered. I'm busy. Caroline, whatever it is can wait. No, it can't. Something in her voice made him pause. He looked up, annoyance flickering across his handsome features. Carolyn laid the photographs on his desk, one by one, watching his face as each image registered. His expression cycled through surprise, then annoyance, then something colder and more calculating than she had ever seen. Oh, where did you get these? It doesn't matter where I got them. What matters is that our son was dying while you were with her, while I called and begged you to answer, while Owen asked for his daddy. You were in a hotel room with your mistress. Derek leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Let's not be dramatic. Caroline, Owen had attacks all the time. He was always sick, always in and out of hospitals. How was I supposed to know this one was different because I called you 17 times? Caroline's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. 17 times. Derek, I left messages. I told you it was an emergency. I begged you to come. He shrugged, the gesture infuriatingly casual. My phone was off. These work dinners, you know how they are. Important clients, sensitive negotiations. I couldn't have it buzzing every 5 minutes. This wasn't a work dinner. She jabbed her finger at the photographs. This was you sleeping with your mistress while our child took his last breath, while I held his hand and watched him die, while I told him daddy was coming. Derek's expression hardened, the mask of the grieving father finally slipping away to reveal something uglier beneath. Fine. You want the truth? Yes, I was with Vivian. And frankly, I'm not sorry. He stood, walking around the desk to face her directly, his height giving him an advantage he clearly enjoyed. Our marriage has been dead for years. You know it. I know it. We were just going through the motions, staying together for appearances. Owen was the only thing keeping us in the same house. And now he's gone. Carolyn slapped him. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot, echoing off the leather-bound books and expensive artwork. Derek's face twisted with fury. He grabbed her wrist, his grip painfully tight, his fingers digging into her bones. Don't ever do that again. His voice was low, dangerous. You understand me. I am not the villain here. I am a man trapped in a loveless marriage with a woman who cares more about being a mother than being a wife. He released her wrist with a shove that made her stumble backward. You want a divorce? Fine, I'll give you a divorce. But you should know something first. He pulled a folder from his desk drawer and tossed it at her feet. Papers scattered across the oriental rug. Pick them up. Read them carefully, because this is your future. Carolyn, she knelt slowly, gathering the documents with trembling hands. Financial statements, loan applications, credit card accounts she did not recognize, all of them bearing her signature. But she had never signed these documents. She had never seen them before. Everything is in my name, Derek said, satisfaction dripping from every word. The house, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, everything we built during this marriage is legally mine. That's not possible. We bought the house together. We checked the deed. He smiled, cold and triumphant. I had it transferred 18 months ago. You signed in the paperwork yourself. Remember that stack of documents I brought home from the lawyer? You trusted me. You didn't even read them. Caroline's blood turned to ice. She remembered that night. She had been exhausted from a double shift at the hospital. Owen had been sick, coughing through the night. Derek had put a pile of papers in front of her, told her they were just routine updates to their estate planning. Sign here, here, and here. She had done it without reading. Too tired to question, too trusting to suspect. And those medical bills for Owen's treatments. Derek continued, clearly enjoying himself. I stopped paying them 2 months ago. The insurance premiums, too. I redirected the money to cover some personal investments. You're personally liable for $180,000. Caroline, hospital bills, equipment rentals, specialist consultations, all in your name. The room spun around her. She gripped the edge of the desk to keep from falling. Divorce me, Derek said, leaning close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. And you walk away with nothing but debt. You'll lose your nursing license when you can't pay your bills. You'll lose your credit. You'll lose everything. He straightened his tie, smoothing his shirt, transforming back into the polished professional the world saw. So think carefully about your next move, sweetheart, because I hold all the cards. And I always win. He walked past her toward the door, pausing at the threshold. Oh, and Caroline, if you try to use those photographs against me, I'll have my lawyers bury you in defamation suits. Vivian's father is a senior partner at one of the biggest law firms in Boston. They'll destroy you before you can blink. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Caroline sat on the floor of her husband's office, surrounded by the evidence of her own destruction, and wondered how she had missed so many signs. How she had loved a monster without ever seeing his true face. But beneath the shock and the fear, something else was growing. Something hot and fierce and unforgiving. Derek thought he had won. He thought she was weak, broken, defeated. He had no idea what she was capable of. The next 72 hours shattered every remaining illusion Caroline had about her marriage and her life. Miles Holbrook did not believe in half measures. When he declared war, he mobilized armies. Within 48 hours of learning about Derek's financial manipulations, he had assembled a team that would have intimidated most Fortune 500 companies. Margaret Foster was a forensic accountant who had spent 25 years uncovering financial crimes for the federal government before retiring to private practice. Her specialty was finding money that people desperately wanted to hide. She arrived at Miles's Cambridge home with 3 laptops, a box of files, and the intensity of a bloodhound on a scent. James Mitchell was a criminal defense attorney with experience in financial crimes, white-collar prosecution, and high-profile divorce cases. He had put away senators, CEOs, and mob bosses. He owed Miles a favor from a case 20 years ago, and he was calling it in. The private investigator's name was Thomas Fletcher, a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate malfeasance. He had contacts in every major financial institution in Boston, people who could access records that were supposed to be confidential. Together, they turned Miles's dining room into a war room. What they found made Caroline physically ill. He forged your signature, Margaret explained, spreading documents across the mahogany table like a surgeon laying out instruments. Not just once, not just for the house transfer. She pulled out stack after stack of papers, 3 separate loan applications, totaling over $200,000, a second mortgage on the townhouse, credit cards opened in your name with balances totaling $93,000. Caroline stared at the papers. Her signature, perfect replicas that she had never written, her social security number, her employment information, all of it used without her knowledge or consent. The forgeries are excellent, Margaret continued. Whoever created them had access to multiple samples of your authentic signature. He must have been collecting them for months, maybe years. He used your credit to fund his gambling habit, James added grimly. Online poker, sports betting, horse racing. According to the records we've obtained, Derek Mercer owes at least $300,000 to various creditors and gambling platforms. Gambling. Caroline shook her head in disbelief. I never knew he gambled. He never mentioned it. I never saw any evidence. They hide it well, Margaret said, especially the ones who come from money, who have reputations to protect. They create separate email accounts, separate phone lines, separate identities. They get very good at compartmentalizing. Miles placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. There's more, and it's worse. Caroline braced herself. How could it possibly be worse? Margaret pulled out another stack of documents. These ones marked with red flags and highlighted passages. These are insurance records. Health insurance, life insurance, coverage for your family. She pointed to a specific line. Derek allowed Owen's health insurance policy to lapse 4 months ago. He stopped paying the premiums. He redirected the money to cover his gambling losses. Caroline felt the blood drain from her face. Owen's medical equipment, his medications, his emergency care, the specialists he needed to see every month. When Owen was admitted to the hospital, Miles said quietly, the bills went directly to you. Derek had already removed himself from financial responsibility. He made sure you would be holding the bag when the marriage ended. He planned this. Caroline's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. He let our son's insurance lapse. He knew Owen was sick. He knew Owen needed that coverage. And he let it lapse anyway. It appears so, James confirmed. The timeline suggests he began systematically separating your finances about 6 months ago, right around the time the affair with Vivian Ashford became serious. Caroline stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. She walked to the window, staring out at the Cambridge street, the snow-covered trees, the ordinary world going about its ordinary business. Her son had died without insurance, without the coverage that might have gotten him faster care, better equipment, more aggressive intervention. And Derek had known. Derek had chosen to let it happen. There's one more thing, Thomas Fletcher said, his voice careful. I tracked the insurance premium payments. The money Derek should have been paying to maintain Owen's coverage. Where did it go? Fletcher pulled up an image on his laptop. Security camera footage from a casino in Atlantic City. He converted it to chips. The night Owen died, 3 hours before Derek met Vivian at the hotel, he was at a blackjack table. He lost $12,000. Then he went to the hotel and turned off his phone. The room fell absolutely silent. Derek had gambled away their son's medical insurance. Then he had gone to his mistress. Then he had ignored 17 calls while Owen fought for his life. And the whole time, for months before that night, he had been planning to leave Caroline buried in debt, stripped of assets, destroyed. I want him in prison, Caroline said, her voice steady now, cold as the winter wind outside. I want his mother's money seized. I want Vivian Ashford exposed. I want everyone who helped him to suffer. Miles nodded slowly. Then it's time to set the trap. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, designed by a man who had spent 3 decades outmaneuvering criminals who thought they were smarter than the law. Miles arranged a meeting with Derek under the pretense of negotiating a settlement. Caroline would not be present. He explained in his carefully worded email. She was too emotional after the funeral, too fragile to handle direct confrontation. She simply wanted the nightmare to end. Derek agreed immediately. Of course he did. In his mind, he had already won. They met at Miles' law office in Cambridge, a stately brownstone filled with leather-bound legal volumes and the weight of decades of justice. The conference room overlooked a snow-covered courtyard, sunlight streaming through tall windows, giving the space an air of authority and permanence. Derek arrived precisely on time, dressed in a $3,000 suit, confidence radiating from every pore. He shook Miles's hand with the grip of a man who had never been denied anything, who believed that money and breeding made him untouchable. Let's make this quick, Derek said, settling into the leather chair across from his father-in-law. I have a dinner meeting at 8, important clients. Of course, Miles kept his expression neutral, almost sympathetic. I appreciate you taking the time to meet. This has been difficult for everyone. Indeed, Derek crossed his legs, completely at ease. I want you to know, Miles, that I have no desire to drag this out. Carolyn has suffered enough. We all have. I'm glad to hear that. Miles slid a document across the polished conference table. A single page, elegant letterhead, minimal text. This is a proposed settlement, he explained. Carolyn will accept $50,000 and walk away quietly. No further claims on assets. No public statements about the marriage or its dissolution. No contact with you or your family going forward. Derek barely glanced at the paper before reaching for a pen from the holder on the table. That's more than fair, he said, already positioning the pen to sign. Honestly, I expected her to fight harder. She always was emotional about money. She's exhausted. Miles watched Derek's hand move toward the signature line. She just wants peace, a chance to start over without constant conflict. Understandable. Derek signed with a flourish, the pen moving in confident strokes. She never had much stomach for confrontation. It's why the marriage failed. Really, she couldn't handle the demands of my world. Miles collected the signed document, examining the signature with careful attention. This is your authentic signature, he asked mildly. No coercion. You're signing this of your own free will. Of course. Derek looked almost offended. What kind of question is that? And you're confirming, by signing this document, that all marital assets were acquired through joint effort during the marriage, that both parties contributed equally to the accumulation of wealth and property. Derek hesitated, the first flicker of uncertainty crossing his handsome face. What its standard language? Miles kept his voice carefully neutral. Just confirming what you've already agreed to in principle. Nothing controversial. Fine, yes. Whatever. Just get me the final papers and let's be done with this. Miles smiled. A small smile, barely visible, but with an edge that made Derek shift uncomfortably in his seat. Thank you, Derek. You've been very helpful. Derek stood, already reaching for his cashmere coat. Send the finalized agreement to my lawyer. I want this wrapped up by the end of the month. Before the holidays, if possible. He was halfway to the door when Miles spoke again. Oh, and Derek, those documents you just signed, they're an admission that all marital assets were acquired jointly during the marriage. You just invalidated your own prenuptial agreement. Derek froze, his hand on the doorknob. What are you talking about? Miles rose from his chair, straightening his tie with deliberate precision. The prenup you had Caroline sign before your wedding stated that assets acquired before the marriage remain separate property. It also specified that any assets you brought into the marriage, including your trust fund distributions and family investments, would remain solely yours in the event of divorce. I know what it said. Derek's voice was sharp now. Defensive. I had my lawyers draft it specifically to protect, but you just signed a document acknowledging that all assets were acquired jointly. Miles picked up the signed paper, examining it as if it were a precious artifact. That includes the Beacon Hill townhouse, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, and, he paused for effect, the offshore holdings in your mother's shell companies. Derek's face drained of color. The confidence evaporated like morning fog. That's ridiculous. That won't hold up in court. I'll say I was coerced. I'll say I didn't understand what I was signing. Will you almost gesture to the corner of the room, a small camera, barely visible among the books and decorative objects, blinked with a steady red light, because I have video evidence of you entering this room voluntarily, reviewing the document, dismissing it as standard language, and signing without any pressure or coercion. I also have audio of you admitting that your marriage failed because your wife, and I quote, couldn't handle the demands of your world. For the first time in his adult life, Derek Mercer looked genuinely afraid. You can't do this. This is entrapment. This is justice. Miles stepped closer, his voice dropping to a register that had made defendants tremble for 3 decades. You stole from my daughter. You forged her signature. You gambled away her son's insurance. You left her to hold your debts while you played house with your mistress. Derek stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chair. My mother will... She has connections. She'll make this go away. Your mother, Miles said calmly, is currently the subject of a federal investigation into tax evasion and money laundering. I filed the complaint myself 3 days ago. Her offshore accounts have been frozen pending review. Her assets are being traced as we speak. Derek's hand trembled as he gripped the doorframe for support. You're lying. Am I? The office door opened behind him. Judith Mercer stood in the doorway, her face pale with fury, her designer coat still dusted with snowflakes from the street outside. Derek, she said sharply, we need to leave. Now. Miles smiled again. That same small, dangerous smile. Mrs. Mercer? Perfect timing. I was just explaining to your son how the next few months of his life are going to unfold. Judith Mercer had not built a fortune by being stupid. She was 65 years old, born into old Boston money, married into older Boston money, and had spent 4 decades protecting and growing the Mercer family wealth. She sat on boards. She attended charity galas. She lunched with senators' wives and vacationed with hedge fund managers. And she had survived 3 federal investigations without ever being charged. She was not about to let a retired prosecutor destroy everything she had built. I know about the Whitfield case. Miles, she said, her voice ice cold and perfectly controlled. 1998, Thomas Whitfield, convicted of murder based on circumstantial evidence and your, shall we say, creative approach to discovery. Miles' expression flickered, just for a moment, just a fraction of a second, but Judith saw it. I have documents, she continued, affidavits from witnesses who were never called, evidence that was conveniently misplaced, a pattern of prosecutorial conduct that would make very interesting reading for the Massachusetts Bar Association. That case was reviewed. Miles's voice was steady, but something had shifted in his posture. Whitfield was guilty. The evidence supported. The evidence supported your conviction rate. Judith stepped closer, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. You were ambitious. Miles, you wanted to be Attorney General, and you were willing to cut corners to get there. Derek straightened, sensing the shift in power. He moved to stand beside his mother, drawing strength from her certainty. Should have stayed retired. Old man, he said, a smirk returning to his face. You're out of your league now. Miles looked at the woman who had protected her son through decades of affairs, gambling, and financial crimes. The woman who had helped him hide assets, forge documents, destroy the lives of anyone who got in his way. For a moment, he considered calling her bluff. He had faced down drug lords and mob bosses. He had prosecuted men who murdered witnesses and threatened judges. Judith Mercer, for all her money and connections, was not in that league. But she did not need to be. She only needed to create doubt, to muddy the waters, to give Derek's lawyers ammunition to challenge every piece of evidence Miles had gathered. If she went public with the allegations about the Whitfield case, it would not matter if they were true. The accusation alone would taint everything. The media would have a field day. Retired prosecutor, accused of misconduct. Every conviction he had ever won would be questioned. Every defendant he had put away would file appeals. And Caroline's case against Derek would collapse under the weight of his compromised credibility. Get out, Miles said quietly. Both of you, now. Derek laughed, the sound ugly with triumph. We'll see you in court, old man. And when we're done, your daughter will be lucky to afford a studio apartment. They left without another word, the door closing behind them with a finality that echoed through the empty office. Miles sat alone in the conference room for a long time, staring at the signed document in his hands. Evidence that should have been enough. Evidence that might now be worthless. That evening, he told Caroline everything. She listened in silence as he explained Judith's threat, the Whitfield case, the choices he had made 30 years ago that were now coming back to haunt them both. So that's it, she asked when he finished. He wins no. Miles shook his head, his jaw set with determination. He doesn't win. You win, but it has to be you, not me. What do you mean if I'm directly involved in presenting the case against Derek? His lawyers will use my past to discredit everything. They'll claim I manufactured evidence, coerced witnesses, manipulated documents. It doesn't matter if it's true. The accusation will be enough to create reasonable doubt. Caroline stared at him. So you're saying I have to do this alone? I'm saying you have to be the one standing in front of him when it all comes crashing down. Miles leaned forward, taking her hands in his. I'll give you everything you need. The evidence, the contacts, the strategy. I'll be behind you every step of the way. But when you walk into that room to face Derek, it has to be just you. Why? Because he underestimates you. Miles's eyes burned with fierce conviction. He has spent years making you feel small, weak, dependent. He's told everyone you're weak. He believes it himself. And when you destroy him, when you stand there and watch him lose everything, it has to be absolutely clear that you did it yourself. Not your father, not your lawyers. You. Carolyn stood and walked to the window. Outside, snow was falling on the quiet Cambridge street. Children played on a neighbor's lawn, their laughter drifting through the glass. She thought about Owen, about the 17 phone calls Derek had ignored, about the insurance he had gambled away, about the debt he had piled on her shoulders while planning his escape. She thought about every time he had dismissed her opinions, every time he had made her feel stupid for asking questions, every time she had swallowed her doubts because she wanted to believe in the life they were building together. She thought about her father, the man who had always protected her, the man who was now stepping aside, not because he didn't love her, but because he believed she was strong enough to stand on her own. "Okay," she said quietly. "Tell me what I need to do." The next 3 weeks were the hardest of Caroline's life. She met with James Mitchell every morning, learning how to present evidence clearly and persuasively. She practiced answering hostile questions, the kind Derek's lawyers would throw at her to make her seem unstable, vindictive, unreliable. She memorized timelines and documents until she could recite them in her sleep, the dates of Derek's gambling losses, the amounts he had forged in her name, the precise moment when Owen's insurance lapsed, the 17 calls she had made on the night her son died. She met with the 3 women Derek had victimized before her. Rachel Montgomery was 33 now, working at a small investment firm in Connecticut, far from Boston and its memories. She had been 24 when Derek targeted her, young and ambitious and desperate to prove herself. "He made me feel special," Rachel said, her voice steady but her hands trembling around her coffee cup, "like I was the only person in the world who understood him. He told me his marriage was a formality, that he was going to leave his wife, that we would build a life together." She laughed bitterly. "I believed him until I found out there were 2 other women at the same time. What happened when you tried to leave? He threatened my career, said he would make sure I never worked in finance again, that he would tell everyone I was unstable, that I had pursued him, that I was a liability." Her voice dropped. "His mother offered me $50,000 to sign an NDA and disappear. I was scared. I didn't know what else to do." Anna Campbell's story was similar. So was the third woman's, who asked to remain anonymous, who still flinched when she heard Derek's name. They had all been young. They had all been ambitious. They had all been destroyed. Caroline listened to their stories and felt her resolve harden into steel. She reviewed the forensic accountant's findings until she understood every transaction, every forged signature, every diverted payment. She could trace the path of Derek's gambling debts through shell companies and offshore accounts. She could explain how he had systematically stripped her of assets while keeping his own protected. And she gathered her courage. The hardest part was the nights, lying alone in the guest room of her father's house, staring at the ceiling, missing Owen with an ache that never faded. She would pick up his photograph from the nightstand, trace the lines of his face with her fingertip, and whisper promises into the darkness. "Mommy couldn't save you. Baby, I'm so sorry I couldn't save you, but I'm going to make sure he can never hurt anyone else. I'm going to make sure your story matters." Sometimes she would fall asleep holding the photograph, and in her dreams, Owen was still alive, running through the garden, laughing at something silly, calling for her to come see a butterfly, a ladybug, a particularly interesting cloud. Then she would wake up, and the grief would crash over her like a wave, and she would have to remind herself why she was doing this. Not for revenge, though revenge would be sweet. For justice, for the boy who deserved a father who cared, for the women who had been silenced, for herself, for the years she had wasted on a man who never deserved her. Detective Reynolds came to see her on a cold Wednesday afternoon. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with tired eyes that had seen too much cruelty and too little justice. "We've reviewed all the evidence your team has gathered," he said, sitting across from her at Miles's dining room table. "The forgery charges are solid. Multiple documents, clear pattern of deception, witnesses who can testify to your signature being different from the forged versions, and the financial crimes substantial, money laundering through his mother's offshore accounts, tax evasion, wire fraud. The federal prosecutors are very interested." "What about Owen? What about the night he died? The detective hesitated, his expression softening with something like sympathy. Criminal negligence is harder to prove, he said carefully. We would have to demonstrate that Derek's actions, his decision to ignore your calls, his choice to be with his mistress, directly contributed to Owen's death. That's a high bar to clear. He ignored 17 calls. He let the insurance lapse. Owen didn't get the coverage he needed because Derek was gambling and cheating. I understand, and I believe you, but a jury might see it differently. They might argue that the hospital should have treated Owen regardless of insurance status. They might say you could have called someone else, a neighbor, a friend, so he gets away with it. Caroline's voice cracked with fury and grief. He gets away with letting our son die. I didn't say that. Detective Reynolds leaned forward, his gaze steady. I said criminal negligence is difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But everything else, the forgery, the fraud, the harassment of those women, that's enough to send him to prison for years. That's enough to destroy his career, his reputation, his mother's empire. Caroline took a deep breath, forcing herself to think strategically rather than emotionally. Then that's what we focus on, she said. We build the strongest possible case on the charges that will stick, and we make sure the world knows what kind of man he really is. The detective nodded approvingly. The district attorney's office is prepared to move forward. But there's one more thing we need. What Derek's firm. They've been protecting him for years, covering up his behavior, paying off victims, burying complaints. If we can get them to turn on him, to provide testimony about what they knew and when, the case becomes airtight. How do we make them turn? Detective Reynolds smiled grimly. We make them understand that protecting Derek Mercer is going to cost them a lot more than throwing him to the wolves. The conference room at Whitmore Capitol occupied the entire 42nd floor of a downtown Boston skyscraper. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered sweeping views of the harbor, the winter sun casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table. Original artwork hung on the walls, abstract pieces that probably cost more than Caroline would earn in a decade. Everything about the space screamed wealth, power, and untouchability. Derek Mercer walked into that room expecting a promotion. The partners had called him in for a special meeting, they said, to discuss his future with the firm. He had assumed, in his arrogance, that this meant recognition of his brilliance, perhaps a corner office, perhaps a larger share of the profits. Instead, he found a firing squad. Seated around the massive conference table were the firm's 3 senior partners, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes cold with calculation. A woman from Human Resources sat at one end, a legal pad in front of her, pen poised to document everything. Detective Reynolds stood near the windows, his badge visible on his belt. A federal prosecutor named Richard Sullivan sat beside him, a stack of files in front of him, and at the far end of the table, dressed in a simple black dress, her hands folded calmly in front of her, sat Caroline. She did not speak when Derek entered. She did not need to. She simply watched him realize that everything he had built was about to collapse. What is this? Derek demanded, his gaze sweeping the room, landing on each face in turn. Why is she here? What's going on, Mr. Mercer? One of the senior partners, a silver-haired man named Robert Whitmore, gestured to an empty chair. Please sit down. I'm not sitting down until someone explains what's happening. Derek's voice had risen, panic beginning to crack through his carefully maintained facade. This is highly irregular. I want my lawyer present. Detective Reynolds stepped forward. Derek Mercer, you're under arrest for forgery, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. This is insane. Derek backed away, nearly tripping over a chair. My mother will destroy all of you. She has connections you can't even imagine. Your mother, Richard Sullivan said calmly, is currently in federal custody. She was arrested this morning at her residence in Beacon Hill. Her assets have been frozen pending trial. Derek's face went white. His hand gripped the back of a chair for support. You can't do this, he whispered. You can't. We already have. The evidence was presented methodically, each piece building on the last like bricks in a wall. Margaret Foster explained the forged signatures. displaying documents side by side to show the differences between Caroline's authentic handwriting and Derek's careful forgeries. She traced the flow of money through shell companies and offshore accounts, showing how Derek had systematically stripped Caroline of assets while protecting his own. Rachel Montgomery testified via video link, her face composed but her voice trembling as she described Derek's harassment and the payoff she had received to stay silent. Anna Campbell followed, then the third woman, their stories forming a pattern of predatory behavior spanning years. The human resources representative confirmed that the firm had received multiple complaints about Derek's conduct, all of which had been settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements paid from company funds. Each revelation landed like a hammer blow. The senior partners grew increasingly pale as they realized how much liability Derek had created for the firm, how many lawsuits might follow, how much their own complicity might cost them. We had no knowledge of these activities. Robert Whitmore said hastily, "We trusted Derek's judgment. We assumed that will be for the courts to decide." Richard Sullivan interrupted. "But your cooperation now will be taken into account when determining the firm's culpability." The partners exchanged glances. The calculation was obvious. Derek Mercer versus the entire firm. There was no contest. "We're prepared to cooperate fully with the investigation," Whitmore said. "We'll provide access to all relevant documents and testimony." Derek spun toward them. "You're throwing me under the bus. After everything I've done for this firm, you've done quite enough," Whitmore replied coldly. Derek turned to Carolyn, his face contorted with rage. "This is your doing. You did this. You've destroyed everything." Caroline stood slowly. For a moment, she simply looked at him. This man she had married. This man she had loved. This man who had betrayed her in every possible way. "No," she said quietly, her voice steady as stone. "You destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone could see it." Detective Reynolds approached with handcuffs. "Turn around, please. Mr. Mercer, you can't do this." Derek's voice had risen to a desperate pitch. "I'll fight this. I'll appeal. I'll—" The cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. As Derek was led toward the door, he passed his mother's assistant, a young woman who had come to deliver documents. It was Anna Campbell. "You'll regret this," Derek snarled at her. "All of you, I'll make you pay." Anna looked at him with cold satisfaction, the satisfaction of someone who had waited years for this moment. "No," she said calmly, "I really won't." Derek Mercer was escorted from the building in handcuffs, past the colleagues who had admired him, past the junior analysts who had feared him, past the security guards who had always waved him through with respect. Carolyn watched from the window 42 floors above. She did not feel joy. She did not feel triumph. She felt only exhaustion and the hollow ache of grief that never left. But somewhere beneath all that, she felt something else. Justice, real and tangible, and hers. The trial lasted 3 weeks. It was the kind of trial that captured Boston's attention, filling the courtroom with reporters, curious spectators, and camera crews camped outside. The wealthy husband, the grieving mother, the web of lies and betrayal that stretched across years. Derek's defense team tried every tactic available. They attacked Caroline's credibility, suggesting she was mentally unstable, consumed by grief, seeking revenge rather than justice. They produced character witnesses who testified to Derek's generosity, his philanthropy, his dedication to his work. They claimed the evidence was fabricated. They argued that the forged signatures were actually Caroline's, that she had signed willingly and was now lying to punish her husband for the affair. They suggested that the gambling records had been manipulated, that the harassment claims were coordinated attacks by disgruntled former employees. None of it worked. Rachel Montgomery took the stand and described, in devastating detail, how Derek had isolated her from her colleagues, promised her a future that never materialized, then threatened to destroy her career when she tried to leave. She showed the jury copies of his text messages, screenshots of his late-night calls, evidence she had saved for years because she always knew this day might come. Anna Campbell testified about the culture of fear Derek had created at the firm, how junior employees learned never to refuse his demands, how complaints disappeared into human resources and never emerged, how she had watched 3 colleagues leave rather than continue working near him. Margaret Foster explained the financial crimes in terms the jury could understand, how Derek had forged his wife's signature to take out loans, how he had redirected insurance payments to cover gambling losses, how he had systematically transferred assets out of Caroline's name while she nursed their sick child. Dr. Patricia Ellis, Owen's cardiologist, testified about the impact of lapsed insurance, the missed appointments, the monitoring equipment that should have been upgraded, the warning signs that might have been caught earlier if Owen had received proper preventive care. She could not say with certainty that Owen would have survived if his insurance had remained active. Medicine did not deal in certainties, but she could say that his chances would have been better, that the standard of care he received was compromised by financial constraints that should never have existed. And then Caroline testified. She spoke for over 2 hours. Her voice was steady. Her answers were precise. She did not break down, did not sob, did not perform grief for the cameras. She simply told the truth. She described her marriage, the slow erosion of trust and connection, the growing suspicion that something was wrong. She explained how Derek had isolated her from friends and family, made her dependent on him, convinced her that she was not smart enough to manage their finances. She recounted the night Owen died, the 17 phone calls, the voicemails that went unanswered. The moment when the doctors told her they had done everything they could, she described finding the evidence of Derek's betrayal, the photographs, the forged documents, the mountain of debt he had piled on her shoulders, and she explained what she wanted from the jury. Not revenge, she said, looking at each juror in turn. I didn't come here looking for revenge. Revenge won't bring my son back. Nothing will bring my son back. She paused, composing herself. I came here looking for accountability, for Derek to face consequences for what he did, for the women he hurt to finally have their stories heard, for the world to know that men like him don't get to keep destroying lives without anyone noticing. She looked at Derek, sitting at the defense table in his expensive suit, his face carefully blank. I loved you, she said quietly. I gave you everything. My trust, my loyalty, my son. And you threw it all away for money and ego and a woman who meant nothing to you. Derek's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I hope you think about that every day for the rest of your life. Caroline continued. I hope you think about Owen, about the sound of his laugh, about the way he called for his daddy in the hospital, wondering why you weren't there. She turned back to the jury. I'm asking you to hold him accountable, not just for me, for every woman who's been silenced, for every family that's been destroyed, for every child who deserved better than a father like him. The prosecution rested. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found Derek Mercer guilty on all counts. The sentencing came a month later. Carolyn sat in the front row of the courtroom, her father beside her. Derek stood before Judge Patricia Winters in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive haircut grown ragged, his arrogance finally stripped away. Mr. Mercer, the judge said, her voice grave, you have been convicted of forgery, wire fraud, money laundering, and multiple counts of conspiracy to commit financial crimes. You have systematically betrayed your wife, your family, your colleagues, and the laws of this nation. Derek stared at the floor. You used your position of trust to steal from the woman you promised to love and protect. You allowed your child's medical care to lapse while you indulged your addictions. You silenced women who tried to speak out against your abuse. The judge's voice hardened. This court sentences you to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. You will be required to pay full restitution to all victims of your crimes. Your professional licenses are permanently revoked. You will never work in financial services again. The gavel fell. Derek was led away without looking back. Carolyn watched him go. She waited to feel something, triumph or satisfaction or closure, but all she felt was tired. Tired and sad and empty. Her father took her hand. It's over, sweetheart. No, she said quietly. It's just beginning. 6 months after Derek's conviction. Carolyn stood at the edge of a small memorial garden on the outskirts of Boston. The garden had been funded anonymously. Though Caroline knew it was her father, Miles refused to confirm or deny. But she recognized his hand in the careful design, the attention to detail, the inscription on the entrance sign, the Owen Mercer Memorial Garden, a place of healing for families who have lost children. Spring had finally arrived, tentative and tender after the long winter. Flowers bloomed in careful rows, tulips and daffodils and crocuses pushing up through soil that still remembered the frost. A small fountain trickled peacefully at the center, its gentle sound mingling with birdsong. Benches offered places to sit and remember, to grieve and to hope. Caroline walked the winding path to the far corner, where a young oak tree had been planted in Owen's honor. The sapling was small, barely taller than she was, its leaves just beginning to unfurl in the warming air. A brass plaque was embedded in the stone at its base. Owen James Mercer, 5 years of laughter, forever in our hearts. Carolyn knelt in the soft grass and placed a bouquet of white roses against the plaque. Owen's favorite color had been blue, but he had loved white roses because they reminded him of snow. And Owen had loved snow more than anything in the world. I couldn't save you, baby, she whispered. I tried so hard. I called and nobody came. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. The wind stirred the leaves of the little oak tree, a gentle rustling that almost sounded like a child's laughter. But I made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. I made sure everyone knows what he did. I made sure your story matters. She touched the plaque, tracing the letters of his name. I think about you every day, every single day. I see your face when I close my eyes. I hear your voice when the house is quiet. I feel you with me, always, everywhere I go. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. Your grandpa says you would be proud of me. He says I found strength I did not know I had. Maybe he's right, but I would give it all up, every bit of it, just to hold you one more time. She sat back on her heels, looking up at the tree that would grow taller each year, a living monument to her son's brief and beautiful life. I'm going to be okay, she said. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday I'm going to find a way to carry this grief and still keep living. That's what you would want, isn't it? You always wanted everyone to be happy. The fountain bubbled peacefully behind her. Somewhere in the garden, a cardinal sang. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path. Caroline turned to see Dr. Patricia Ellis approaching, the cardiologist who had fought so hard to save Owen's life. I thought I might find you here, Dr. Ellis said gently. She was older than Caroline, with gray streaking her dark hair and kind lines around her eyes. May I sit? Caroline nodded, making room on the small bench near the tree. They sat in silence for a while, watching the wind ripple through the spring flowers. There's something I wanted to talk to you about, Dr. Ellis finally said. I've been thinking about it for months, but I wanted to wait until the trial was over, until you had some space to breathe. What is it? Dr. Ellis turned to face her. I'm part of a foundation being formed for children with heart conditions whose families can't afford proper monitoring equipment, early intervention systems, emergency response training, the kind of care that might have made a difference for Owen. Carolyn felt her breath catch. That sounds wonderful. We need someone to lead the outreach program, Dr. Ellis continued. Someone who understands what these families go through. Someone who's been there, who knows the fear and the uncertainty and the desperate hope. She paused. Someone who can speak to other parents with authenticity and compassion. You're asking me, I'm asking you. Caroline looked back at the garden, at the flowers blooming in the spring sun, at the little oak tree stretching its branches toward the light. I don't know if I can, she said slowly. I'm still so broken. Some days I can barely get out of bed. I know. Dr. Ellis placed a gentle hand on Caroline's arm. And there's no pressure, no timeline. But I want you to know that the option is there. Whenever you're ready, your experience, your voice, your story, they have power. They could help other families avoid what you went through. Caroline was quiet for a long moment, turning the idea over in her mind. She thought about the months since Owen's death, the crushing grief that had nearly destroyed her, the rage that had given her strength when she had none left, the trial, the testimony, the satisfaction of watching Derek led away in handcuffs. She thought about what came next, the empty days, the silent house, the question that had haunted her, what now? Maybe this was the answer. Maybe the worst thing that had ever happened to her could become something meaningful. Maybe Owen's death could save other lives. There are moments in every person's life when they stand at a crossroads, when the pain of the past and the possibility of the future converge into a single choice. These are the moments that define us, not by what was done to us, but by what we choose to do next. Caroline had lost everything: her son, her marriage, her faith in the life she had built. But she had also gained something: strength she never knew she possessed, purpose forged in fire, the knowledge that she could survive the worst and still find a reason to keep moving forward. "When do we start?" she asked. "Doctor," Ellis smiled. "Whenever you're ready." Carolyn stood. She looked at Owen's tree one more time, at the little oak that would grow tall and strong, that would provide shade for future visitors, that would stand as a testament to a boy who was loved beyond measure. "I'm ready," she said. 3 months later, the foundation launched its first program. Caroline spoke at the opening ceremony, standing before a room full of parents, doctors, donors, and reporters. She wore a simple blue dress, Owen's favorite color. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the podium, but her voice was clear and strong. She told Owen's story. She talked about the 17 phone calls, about the insurance that lapsed, about the system that failed her son, about the husband who prioritized his mistress over his dying child. But she also talked about hope. "We can't change what happened," she said, looking out at the audience. "We can't bring back the children we've lost. The pain of that loss never fully goes away. It becomes part of us, woven into who we are." She paused, composing herself. "But we can make sure their stories matter. We can build something that protects other families from the same heartbreak. We can transform our grief into action, our loss into legacy." Some audience members were crying. Others were nodding. All were listening. "My son's heart gave out on a December night," she continued. "But his love, his beautiful, generous, unconditional love, is still beating. In every child we help, in every family we support, in every life we save." She looked at the foundation's logo projected on the screen behind her, a small heart with Owen's name beneath it. "This is for him. This is for all of them. And this is for every parent who has ever held their child's hand and prayed for one more day." The audience rose to their feet, applauding. Miles watched from the back of the room, tears streaming down his weathered face. His daughter had become something extraordinary. Not just a survivor, a leader, a voice for the voiceless. After the ceremony, Carolyn walked outside into the spring sunshine. The world was green and growing, full of possibilities she had not been able to see in the darkness of winter. She thought about Derek, serving his sentence in a federal facility, about Judith, stripped of her fortune and her power, awaiting her own trial, about Vivian, whose career had been destroyed by the scandal, who had fled Boston in disgrace. She thought about justice, and whether it was ever really enough. And she thought about Owen. Somewhere, she knew, he was watching, proud of his mother, proud of the woman she had become. She tilted her face toward the sun and closed her eyes, feeling its warmth on her skin, feeling something like peace settle into her heart. "They thought grief would break me," she whispered. "They thought silence would bury me. But some women don't break. We burn. And when we rise from the ashes, we make sure the ones who tried to destroy us can never hurt anyone again." The wind carried her words away, scattering them like seeds across the awakening earth. And somewhere in a garden planted in his memory, a small oak tree stretched its branches toward the light, growing stronger with each passing day, just like his mother.